All right, so it's day 20 of the war in the Persian Gulf. And let's be clear, what we're witnessing is so much more than just another regional conflict. This is a tectonic shift in global power, and it's happening right before our eyes. Today, we're going to break down how a war that was supposed to be over in 4 days is now threatening to pull apart a world order that's been in place for half a century. Okay, here's what we're covering. We'll start with how this quick war turned into a stalemate. Then we'll look at the economic fallout, this Hormuz toll road situation, and the global meltdown it's causing. From there, we'll see how the West is starting to fracture under the pressure. And that all leads to the big one, the challenge to the petrodollar. Finally, we'll talk about the point of no return and what could happen next. So first up, a failed war. You know, the plan going in was for a quick 100-hour operation, but what we're seeing 20 days later is a completely different reality. So the whole idea, the expectation, was this lightning-fast 100-hour war, a decapitation strike designed to just shatter the Iranian regime from the top. What? The reality? Well, 20 days in, it's a brutal quagmire, a high attrition conflict with, frankly, no clear exit strategy in sight.
So what went wrong? Well, the central bet was that taking out the leadership would cause the whole system to collapse. You'd see defections, chaos. But that's just not what happened. In fact, it did the exact opposite. It's energized Iran's base, and now they're framing this as an existential fight for survival. And you know, just look at the logistical burn rate here. In only 20 days, the US has used 1.5 times the number of Patriot interceptors in the Gulf than it sent to Ukraine during the entire war. Think about that. This conflict has turned into what experts are calling a massive interceptor sink, and it's draining Western stockpiles at an unbelievable speed. Okay, so this military stalemate on the ground, it's allowed Iran to play its biggest card. They've effectively weaponized the world's most critical choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, and turned it into their own personal toll road. And the results are just staggering. I mean, look at this. Before the war, you'd see around 200 vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Today, that number is less than 8. That's a collapse of over 95%. It's a total chokehold, and it puts the entire global energy market at Iran's mercy. Now, what's so brilliant about this, from their perspective, is that they didn't go for the quote-unquote suicide option of just mining the whole strait shut. No, they're doing something much savvier. They're calling it a smart closing. They've basically become the bouncer at the door. They decide who gets in and who doesn't, which gives them incredible leverage over their friends like China and Russia and, well, anyone else who's willing to play by their new rules. And as you can probably guess, this control over Hormuz isn't just a regional problem. It's triggering a massive butterfly effect, sending shockwaves through the entire global economy. Energy analysts are basically forecasting a nightmare scenario right now. They're saying if this blockade holds for even another couple of weeks, oil prices will absolutely test $150 a barrel. Some are even saying $200 isn't out of the question. I mean, a price like that, it doesn't just cause problems, it guarantees a deep, painful global recession. And of course, the pain is most acute right there in the Gulf. I mean, their entire economic model is built on exporting oil and gas through that strait. With that tap turned off, you're seeing catastrophic projections. Look at Qatar, facing a potential 14% contraction of its entire economy. It's just devastating. But here's the thing, it's not just about oil. These supply chain crises are cascading. Take helium. Most people don't think about it, but Qatar is a huge producer. That shortage means fewer MRI machines can operate worldwide. But the really terrifying one, the urea factor. 35% of the world's fertilizer supply is now cut off, right as the Northern Hemisphere is supposed to be planting. This isn't a maybe. It guarantees a catastrophic harvest failure. We are staring down the barrel of a global food crisis. All right, so with all this economic and military pressure building, it's no surprise that we're starting to see major alliances crack. The West is starting to fracture. So President Trump put out the call for a naval coalition, right? Let's go open the strait back up. And the response from key NATO allies, Germany, France, the UK, you name it, was basically a hard pass. They see this as America's war of choice, one they want absolutely no part of. And just like that, the US is left looking strategically very, very alone. And it's not just international alliances that are cracking. The fractures are showing up right inside the US government. I mean, you have the National Counterterrorism Director, Joe Kent, resigning, and not quietly. His public letter is explosive, basically alleging that the country was deceived into war. This isn't just a disagreement, it's a deep institutional rift breaking out into the open.
But all of this, the military stalemate, the economic chaos, the political fractures, it's all been a prelude to this, the most significant move of all. Iran is now unsheathing its financial weapon and taking direct aim at the very foundation of American global power, the petrodollar. So, just a quick refresher on what the petrodollar system is, because it's so important. For the last 50 years, there's been a simple rule. If you want to buy oil on the global market, you have to do it in US dollars. This creates this constant, massive global demand for dollars, and it's the bedrock that US financial power has been built on. And here is Iran's plan to break that system. It's elegantly simple, really. Step 1, you control the strait. Step 2, you set a new rule. You only get passage if you pay for that oil in something other than US dollars. And step 3, you force the world to accept a new precedent, shattering the old system.
And look, this isn't just some abstract theory anymore. It is happening in real time. Just a few days ago, on March 16th, Pakistan, a major U.S. ally, mind you, had to pay for an oil shipment from the UAE using Chinese yuan. Why? Because that was the only way Iran would let their tanker pass through the strait. The first crack in the petrodollar dam has appeared. So, this brings us to the point of no return. The initial military plan is in ruins. U.S. financial dominance is under direct attack, and frankly, the U.S. is cornered, with only bad options left. What we're all looking at now is a terrifying escalation ladder with no clear way to get off. And when we say the options are bad, they are truly horrifying. We're talking about everything from arming militias to try and start a civil war inside Iran to a full-blown ground invasion. Even strikes on critical civilian infrastructure like desalination plants that provide drinking water are on the table. And what's most chilling, analysts are reporting that the use of tactical nuclear weapons is no longer being ruled out by US and Israeli officials. You know, what this war has really done is pull back the curtain on just how fragile the US-led global system has become. The petrodollar, the idea of Western military deterrence, the stability of global supply chains, they're all fracturing at the same time. So the real question we're left with isn't just how does this war end? It's what on earth comes next? What kind of world emerges from all this wreckage?
Right now, a Pakistani oil tanker called the Karachi is sailing safely out of the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, completely untouched.
Right. It is totally untouched by the Iranian military. It's passing right through one of the most heavily contested bodies of water on the planet without a single scratch. And why?
It is wild when you think about the reason.
It really is. It's because the government in Islamabad negotiated a deal to pay for the oil on that ship using Chinese yuan instead of US dollars.
Which is just, I mean, it is a profound shift. We are watching a fundamental rewiring of the global financial system happening in real time.
Exactly. And with that single transaction, the era of the American petrodollar might have just ended. Welcome to today's Deep Dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
It is the morning of Thursday, March 19, 2026. You are listening to our ongoing analysis of the situation in the Middle East. We are exactly 20 days into the United States and Israeli military campaign against Iran.
20 days that feel like 20 years, honestly.
Seriously. And, you know, our mission today is to look past the immediate smoke of the kinetic strikes. We have gathered a massive stack of the latest geopolitical intelligence reports, military analyses, and international journalism from just the last 48 hours.
And we are sifting through all of it to map out the scenarios for the weeks ahead. Because what's fascinating here is that the narrative we were all handed at the end of February.
You mean that rapid 100-hour surgical strike idea?
Right. That idea of a 4-day shock and awe operation has completely evaporated. The sources we are reviewing today paint a picture of a conflict that has rapidly metastasized.
Yeah, it is definitely no longer a contained regional exchange. It is an active global war of attrition.
Completely.
Okay, let's unpack this. If you have been watching the news, you see the stock market swings, you hear the geopolitical rhetoric, and it can feel like just a disconnected series of emergencies.
It is overwhelming for anyone trying to follow it.
So today, we are connecting the dots for you. We are going to explain the why and the how behind the headlines. We need to explore how a stalled military strategy has forced a shift to economic warfare.
And how that economic warfare is triggering massive supply chain cascades across the globe.
Right, and ultimately, how this might reshape U.S. hegemony permanently.
To understand the macroeconomic shockwaves, though, we first have to understand the mechanics of the battlefield.
We have to look at why the initial military strategy failed to achieve that quick surgical victory that was promised.
Exactly. The intelligence reports in our stack keep using a very specific term for that initial strategy. They call it decapitation.
I see that word everywhere in these briefs. What exactly does decapitation mean in this specific military context?
Well, in Western military doctrine, decapitation is the strategy of targeting the absolute highest echelon of an adversary's leadership. So the political elite, the top generals, the central communication hubs. The working theory is that if you remove the top layer of command, the entire military apparatus below it will just be paralyzed by lack of orders and eventually implode.
It sounds like trying to stop a huge corporation by taking out the CEO and the board of directors. You just assume their regional managers won't know what to do and the company halts.
That is exactly the assumption. And from a strictly tactical execution standpoint, I mean, the U.S. and Israeli forces have been successful in hitting high-value targets.
Right. The reports confirm the assassination of Ali Larijani, for example.
Yeah, who was a massive figure in the Iranian establishment. He was a former parliament speaker, a central player in their security apparatus, and historically a key consensus maker.
A huge loss for their diplomatic wing, absolutely.
And alongside confirmed strikes like that, the information space is just flooded with rumors about the supreme leader himself.
Oh, the rumors are everywhere. The intelligence briefs note swirling, unconfirmed reports ranging from him sustaining severe injuries to claims of him being flown to Russia for emergency medical surgery.
I even saw one brief mentioning a tabloid rumor floating around the New York Post.
Oh, right. The one alleging the supreme leader was secretly homosexual. The sources said President Trump supposedly laughed at that during an intelligence briefing.
Yeah, it just shows how chaotic and surreal the information warfare has become right now.
It really does. But, whether those rumors are true or not is almost beside the point strategically, right?
Completely.
Yeah.
Because the consensus among the military analysts and our sources is that the decapitation strategy is failing.
Mm-hmm.
And it is failing because it fundamentally misunderstands the architecture of the Iranian military.
Specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
Right.
But how so? I mean, if you take out the top guys, why isn't the system collapsing like the doctrine says it should?
Because the IRGC is not a rigid top-down hierarchy. It is a horizontally integrated, highly decentralized network.
Okay, meaning what on the ground?
Meaning, over the last 3 decades, Iranian military planners explicitly designed their command structure based on the assumption that they would eventually face a massive aerial bombardment from the United States.
So they planned for this exact scenario.
Yes. They knew their central communications would be severed in the first hour of a war.
It reminds me of the underlying architecture of the internet, because the internet was originally designed by the Department of Defense to survive a nuclear strike.
That is a really great way to look at it.
Right. If you destroy a centralized server farm, the network just routes the data around the crater. You can't kill it by hitting one spot. Why would military planners assume taking out a few top guys would collapse a system designed specifically to survive an invasion?
It was a fatal miscalculation. The IRGC operates on a principle of pre-delegated authority.
Pre-delegated authority, meaning they don't have to ask permission.
Exactly. Local commanders running missile silos in the mountains or drone operators on the coast, they do not need real-time authorization from Tehran to execute their defensive protocols. If the capital goes dark, if the top generals are assassinated, the local units are already authorized and equipped to continue firing autonomously. The network routes around the damage.
Which makes the whole decapitation strategy seem incredibly short-sighted.
It really does.
Because if the system is designed to ignore the loss of its leadership, all you're really doing is killing the people you might eventually need to talk to end the war.
And that is the profound irony highlighted in the diplomatic analyses we reviewed.
Yeah.
By successfully targeting consensus makers and seasoned political operators like Larijani, the U.S., and Israel have functionally eliminated the very people who possess the political capital to negotiate an off-ramp or a ceasefire.
You take out the diplomats, and you are left exclusively with the hardliners.
Right. You are leaving command in the hands of the most militaristic factions, the true believers who view this conflict not as a political dispute, but as an existential war of survival.
And in a war of survival, capitulation is not an option.
Never. By trying to force a quick end, the strikes have effectively guaranteed a prolonged war.
And as this war drags on, the math of that decentralized resistance is creating a massive problem for the U.S. military. The sources emphasize a phenomenon they are calling an interceptor sink.
Yes, the interceptor sink. This is crucial.
Break down what that means for us because it seems to be driving everything else.
So an interceptor sink refers to the rapid, unsustainable depletion of defensive surface-to-air missiles. To defend regional bases and Israeli airspace, the U.S. relies on highly sophisticated air defense networks.
Systems like the Patriot missile batteries.
Exactly, Patriot batteries, or FIA, which stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense.
These are the missiles that shoot down the incoming missiles.
Correct. But the economics of this exchange are heavily skewed. Let's look at the Patriot system. A single Patriot PAC-3 MSE interceptor costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 to $5 million.
$4 to $5 million for one missile.
For one, and often, doctrine requires firing 2 interceptors at a single target to guarantee a kill.
Oh, wow. So you are spending $8 to $10 million every single time you pull the trigger.
Yes. Now, compare that to the incoming threats. The Iranian forces and their regional allies are utilizing mass-produced loitering munitions.
Like the Shahed series drones we keep hearing about.
Right, the Shaheds, or older, unguided ballistic missiles. A Shahed drone costs roughly $20,000 to $30,000 to manufacture.
That is insane. So
Yeah.
we are firing a $10 million defense at a $20,000 piece of flying fiberglass and a lawnmower engine.
And that is the mathematical trap of the interceptor sink. The analysts point out a staggering metric in the report.
I saw this. It blew my mind.
The United States has expended 1.5 times more Patriot interceptors in the Middle East in the last 15 days than it supplied to Ukraine throughout the entirety of that multi-year conflict.
That is just incredible. In just 2 weeks, they burned through more inventory than in years of European warfare.
Because the production capacity of the U.S. defense industrial base is just not designed for this volume.
Right.
Lockheed Martin might produce a few hundred of these advanced interceptors a year. Iran can manufacture thousands of cheap drones in the exact same time frame.
You cannot sustain a positive defense ratio indefinitely under those conditions.
No, you can't. Even when the U.S. wins a tactical engagement, meaning they successfully shoot down the drone and protect the base, they lose the broader economic exchange.
It's an attrition trap. I mean, if I have 100 cheap drones and you only have 50 expensive missiles, I don't need my drones to be better than your missiles.
Not at all.
I just need to keep launching until your magazines are empty. And once your magazines are empty, my remaining drones get through.
Precisely. And because Iran recognized that their decentralized network survived the initial bombardment, and they saw the mathematics of this interceptor sink bleeding U.S. resources, they realized they had the leverage to shift the battlefield.
Which takes us out of the airspace and down into the shipping lanes. Because if you can't defeat the U.S. military head-on, you attack the infrastructure that sustains their power.
That is the pivot.
Let's dig into the situation at the Strait of Hormuz, and the strategy analysts are calling the smart blockade.
Right. So for decades, the ultimate nightmare scenario for the global energy market was always that a conflict with Iran would result in them mining the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is that narrow geographic choke point where roughly 20 to 25% of the world's daily oil consumption passes through.
Yes. The assumption was always that they would just sink a few massive ships, lay down a wall of sea mines, and completely shut it down. A total blockade.
But a total blockade is a blunt instrument.
Very blunt. It harms everyone equally, including Iran's own allies and trading partners like China.
So they didn't do that.
No. The intelligence sources outline that Iran has done something far more sophisticated. They have instituted a financial filter.
Explain how financial filter works on the open ocean. How do you filter a ship?
Well, Iran is heavily monitoring the strait using naval assets, coastal batteries, and drones. They are signaling to international shipping companies that safe passage will be granted, but with a very specific condition. They are not demanding a toll in the traditional sense. They are demanding that the oil being transported on those vessels must be paid for in Chinese yuan.
Also known as the renminbi, or RMB.
Right. It has to be paid in yuan instead of US dollars.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. We usually think of a blockade as a giant concrete wall across a shipping lane.
Exactly.
But this isn't a wall. It's a toll booth. And the toll booth only accepts the currency of America's biggest rival.
That is a perfect analogy.
And this brings us back to that Pakistani oil tanker, the Karachi. The reports detail that this ship wasn't even carrying Iranian oil.
No, it was carrying oil from Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates.
Right. But to get that Emirati oil out of the Gulf safely, the government of Pakistan had to broker an agreement with Tehran, proving that the transaction for the oil was settled in Chinese currency.
The logistics of how a nation actually executes that swap are complex, but incredibly revealing.
Yeah, how does that actually work behind the scenes?
Historically, if Pakistan wanted to buy oil from the UAE, their central bank would use U.S. dollars, clearing the transaction through the SWIFT banking system.
Which is heavily monitored and influenced by the United States.
Yes, but to comply with this new smart blockade, a country like Pakistan has to bypass SWIFT entirely.
Wow.
They have to utilize China's cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS. They must secure a credit line of RMB from Beijing, hold it in a Chinese clearing bank, and transfer it directly to an account recognized by the UAE and cleared by Tehran.
So they are completely routing around the U.S. banking system. Why is this such a catastrophic threat to U.S. power? Because people hear about currency swaps and their eyes kind of glaze over, but the sources treat this as a bigger deal than the missile strikes themselves.
It is a massive deal because it strikes at the absolute foundation of American global hegemony, the petrodollar.
Give us a quick refresher on the petrodollar.
Back in the 1970s, following the collapse of the gold standard, the United States struck an agreement with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations.
The basic deal was protection for pricing, right?
Exactly. The agreement was simple. The U.S. would provide military protection and hardware to the Gulf, and in exchange, the Gulf nations would exclusively price and sell their oil in U.S. dollars.
Meaning, if you were Japan or France or Pakistan and you needed oil to keep your economy running, you first had to acquire U.S. dollars.
Yes. This created a permanent artificial global demand for the U.S. currency. Because everyone needed dollars to buy energy, foreign central banks held massive reserves of U.S. Treasury bonds.
And that constant influx of foreign capital is what has allowed the United States government to run massive multi-trillion-dollar deficits for decades without triggering hyperinflation at home.
Exactly. It's a captive market. We printed the money, they had to use it, and we got to borrow endlessly to fund our military and our economy.
And furthermore, it allowed the U.S. to weaponize its currency. If you crossed the United States, they could simply cut you out of the SWIFT system.
Sanction your dollar transactions.
Right, and effectively starve your economy because you could no longer buy oil on the open market. It was the ultimate leverage.
But the smart blockade flips that leverage entirely.
Yeah. How does the U.S. even combat a financial blockade with an aircraft carrier? You can't shoot a currency swap with an F-35 fighter jet.
You really can't. A carrier strike group can't force a bank in Islamabad to use dollars instead of yuan. That is the brilliance of the asymmetric strategy.
Yeah.
Iran has weaponized a physical geographical choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, to force the global south to decouple from the U.S. financial choke point.
They are forcing nations into a stark choice.
Exactly. Do you remain loyal to a U.S. financial system and security umbrella that currently cannot protect your shipping from drone swarms? Or do you bow to Tehran's demands, pay in China's currency, and ensure your factories have the energy they need to operate tomorrow?
And as we're seeing with the Karachi, pragmatism is winning out over loyalty to the dollar, which means China is watching its currency instantly internationalize in the most critical commodity market on Earth.
Without having to fire a single shot or deploy a single warship to the Gulf.
It accelerates the multipolar world order by decades in the span of just 20 days.
It is historic.
But, the reality of forcing these new financial mechanisms while missiles are still flying is that the system isn't transitioning smoothly. The Gulf is still an active war zone.
Very active.
And that friction is triggering what the intelligence reports describe as a massive butterfly effect across seemingly unrelated global supply chains.
Right. When we talk about a butterfly effect in systemic analysis, we're looking at how a localized disruption cascades through highly optimized, incredibly fragile global networks.
Yeah, and the sources point to several kinetic events in the Gulf that are producing terrifying secondary effects right now.
Let's start with the energy infrastructure itself. The reports confirm that Israel recently targeted the South Pars gas field.
Which is a huge escalation. South Pars is the largest natural gas field in the world, located right in the Persian Gulf. And crucially, it is shared territorially with Qatar, where it is known as the North Field.
A strike on an asset that massive doesn't just hurt Iran. And Iran's response was immediate. The intelligence shows they ordered the evacuation of Gulf energy sites and threatened to retaliate against energy facilities in neighboring nations.
Specifically, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. We are already seeing reports of drone strikes hitting fuel farms in places like Dubai.
And the physical disruption of natural gas and oil processing in the Gulf doesn't just mean higher prices at the pump for commuters in the West. It strikes at the base layer of modern human civilization.
The most pressing example highlighted in our sources is what analysts are calling the urea factor.
The urea factor. This is vital to understand.
Explain the urea factor. I think most people hear the word fertilizer and they just think of a bag of topsoil at the local hardware store. How does a gas field in the Middle East dictate global agriculture?
It comes down to industrial chemistry. To grow food at the scale required to feed 8 billion people, you need nitrogen-based fertilizers. To get that nitrogen into a usable form, you utilize a chemical process called the Haber-Bosch process, which synthesizes ammonia. And the primary feedstock required to generate the hydrogen for that ammonia is natural gas.
Wait, so natural gas isn't just for heating homes. It is the literal raw ingredient for fertilizer.
Exactly. You take natural gas, you make ammonia, and from ammonia, you synthesize urea, which is the most widely used solid nitrogen fertilizer in the world.
Wow.
Because the Persian Gulf is drowning in cheap natural gas, they have become the dominant global hub for urea production and export.
And the reports state that right now, because of the evacuations and the strikes, 35% of the global urea supply is completely paralyzed. Over a third of the world's fertilizer is just trapped or offline.
Now, overlay that statistical reality with the calendar. It is March 19, 2026. Geography dictates that roughly 75% of the world's arable land, the land capable of growing crops, is located above the equator.
So we are entering the critical northern hemisphere planting season right now.
The timing is absolute worst-case scenario. If farmers in the American Midwest or in France or in India don't get that urea into the ground in the next few weeks, they miss the window.
They miss the window and crop yields plummet. The intelligence assessments are projecting that this supply chain severance guarantees a catastrophic harvest failure.
It does. They are forecasting massive systemic global food inflation hitting by the third quarter of this year. We are watching a localized energy conflict mutate into an existential threat to global food security.
Think about this for a second. A drone strike on a fuel farm in Dubai directly means a farmer in the American Midwest can't fertilize their crops. Is this the ultimate proof that in a globalized economy, there is no such thing as a contained regional war?
It absolutely is. Everything is connected.
And the supply chain cascades aren't just hitting agriculture. We are seeing bizarre disruptions in healthcare logistics, too.
The reports highlight acute shortages of liquid petroleum gas, or LPG. We are seeing strict LPG rationing taking effect in nations like India and Nepal, where it is a primary fuel source for residential cooking and heating.
And aviation fuel surcharges have skyrocketed globally, which threatens massive air freight corridors.
But the detail and the sources that absolutely stopped me in my tracks was the helium shortage.
Yes. How does a war in the Gulf crash the medical imaging industry?
It goes back to the South Pars and North Field gas reserves we mentioned earlier. Qatar is one of the world's primary suppliers of helium, which they extract as a byproduct of natural gas processing.
Right.
With the Gulf shipping lanes contested and facilities under threat, the global helium supply is severely choked off.
And MRIs need liquid helium.
They desperately need it.
Yeah.
An MRI machine utilizes superconducting magnets to generate its imaging field. To maintain superconductivity, meaning zero electrical resistance, those magnets must be cooled to roughly minus 269 degrees Celsius.
That is freezing.
The only element that can achieve that liquid cooling state is helium. Without the constant supply of liquid helium, the magnets heat up, the machine undergoes what's called a quench, and it essentially destroys itself.
Because of this sudden logistical bottleneck, the MRI medical supply chain is fracturing. The financial data in our stack shows that the stock prices for major diagnostic laboratory networks are crashing.
Companies heavily reliant on imaging revenue, like ThyroCare or Dr. Thal Path Labs.
Yeah, they literally cannot operate their core diagnostic equipment because they can't source the coolant from Qatar.
So a patient waiting for a tumor scan in London, or Seoul, is directly impacted by a naval standoff in the Strait of Hormuz.
It is just wild. Every system relies on every other system. And speaking of critical systems, let's look at the technology sector. The sources highlight a massive strategic vulnerability regarding Taiwan.
Taiwan is the undisputed center of gravity for advanced semiconductor manufacturing. The microchips that run everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to the very U.S. military interceptors we discussed earlier are predominantly fabricated in Taiwan.
But factories that massive require an enormous amount of electricity to run.
And that is Taiwan's Achilles heel. Domestic policy decisions recently led Taiwan to phase out its nuclear power capabilities. They transitioned their energy grid to rely almost entirely on imported fossil fuels, specifically liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
Which they import via ships. ships that are now caught up in a global logistics nightmare.
The geopolitical analyses point out a terrifying metric. Due to the disruptions, Taiwan currently possesses only a 10-day energy reserve window.
10 days.
If shipments halt for more than 10 days, their power grid begins to fail, and the semiconductor fabrication plants go offline.
This completely changes the strategic math for China, doesn't it? Historically, the fear has always been that Beijing would launch a massive kinetic amphibious invasion across the Taiwan Strait to take control of the island.
But the smart blockade in the Gulf has handed China an entirely new mechanism for leverage. China is brokering these yuan-based energy deals. They're securing their own energy imports from the Gulf. China could easily stockpile that energy and then offer to supply Taiwan with the LNG it desperately needs to keep its economy from collapsing.
But that energy would come with immense political strings attached, obviously.
Exactly. Beijing can effectively mediate Taiwan's survival. They can exert absolute political and economic dominance over the island by controlling its energy lifeline, entirely bypassing the risk and destruction of a military invasion.
They can achieve strategic victory through energy diplomacy, a diplomacy made possible by the chaos initiated by the U.S. strikes in Iran.
Which is the ultimate unintended consequence.
Yeah.
The United States launched this military campaign to project strength, to secure its interests, and to reinforce its position as the global hegemon.
Yet, the secondary effects seem to be handing its greatest geopolitical rivals massive strategic victories.
Which leads us to look at the broader geopolitical realignments detailed in the sources. The great paradox of this 20-day war is that the nations benefiting the most are the ones actively avoiding direct military engagement in the Gulf.
Let's start with Russia. The shift here is staggering. Before February, the defining foreign policy objective of the West was to economically isolate Russia due to the war in Ukraine.
Right. The U.S. was enforcing strict price caps and sanctions on Russian oil exports.
So what do the reports say is happening now?
The global energy markets are panicking over the potential loss of Gulf oil. We are seeing credible financial forecasts warning that crude oil could blow past $150 to even $200 a barrel if the shipping lanes close entirely.
$200 a barrel.
To prevent that level of catastrophic inflation from hitting the American consumer, the sources note that President Trump has been forced to quietly lift the sanctions on Russian oil.
He had to release the pressure on Putin to keep gas prices in the U.S. from causing domestic riots.
And as a direct result, the Russian economy is experiencing a massive boom. They are suddenly flooded with unexpected oil revenue at premium market prices.
While Russia is getting rich, what is happening to the battlefield dynamics in Eastern Europe?
The reports describe a profound missile famine developing for the Ukrainian military. We discussed the interceptor sink earlier, the U.S. burning through its Patriot reserves in the Middle East.
Right.
Because those finite defense systems are being prioritized for bases in the Gulf and for Israel. They are not being shipped to Kyiv.
You can't send a Patriot battery to defend European airspace if you need it to defend Tel Aviv or a carrier group in the Red Sea.
The U.S. strategy in the Middle East is fundamentally cannibalizing its strategic posture in Europe. By starving the Ukrainian defense forces of interceptors, the U.S. is ensuring that Russia maintains a decisive upper hand in that theater.
So what does this all mean? We went in to show dominance, but we have essentially handed China and Russia a geopolitical gift basket. Are we witnessing the real-time death of the rules-based order?
It certainly looks like it. And Russia and China aren't just passively benefiting from the chaos. The intelligence reports indicate they are taking active, albeit covert, steps to prolong the U.S. quagmire.
The stack includes high-confidence intelligence assessments, claiming that both Moscow and Beijing are providing real-time targeting intelligence to Iranian forces.
Yeah.
But how does that work mechanically? Are there Russian generals sitting in Iranian bunkers?
Not necessarily. It is about data integration and sensor fusion. The U.S. military relies heavily on stealth, electronic warfare, and blinding the adversary's radar.
Okay.
But if Iran's domestic radar networks are jammed or destroyed, Russia and China can utilize their own vast arrays of military satellites and regional sensors to track U.S. and Israeli naval movements. They can securely downlink that telemetry to the IRGC command nodes.
Which explains a trend noted in the combat analyses. The Iranian strikes are getting more precise, more sharp as the war goes on.
Exactly. They aren't just firing blind. They have the sensor networks of two global superpowers guiding their munitions.
It is proxy warfare operating at a highest technological level. And while the adversaries of the U.S. are coordinating their efforts, the traditional alliances of the United States are visibly fracturing.
The diplomatic cables we reviewed regarding NATO are genuinely shocking. the U.S. finds itself increasingly isolated.
Realizing that the U.S. Navy could not secure the entirety of the Strait of Hormuz alone while simultaneously fending off daily attacks, President Trump formally demanded that European allies deploy their warships to the region to form a coalition to break the blockade.
A call for a united Western front. And how did Europe respond?
They flatly refused. The reports detail that major NATO allies, including Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Spain, just denied the request.
They completely ghosted the president's demand. Why? What is the legal or political justification for abandoning their primary ally?
The response from Berlin provides the clearest insight. The German chancellor reportedly stated on the record, "This is not our war."
Wow.
The justification rests on the fundamental mechanics of the NATO treaty. NATO is strictly a defensive alliance under Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. However, the U.S. and Israel initiated the kinetic strikes against Iran offensively, and crucially, they did so without consulting their European partners beforehand.
So Europe's position is, you started an out-of-area offensive war without asking us, so you don't get to invoke the alliance to clean up the mess when it goes wrong.
Exactly. From the European perspective, deploying their navies into a drone-saturated choke point is a suicidal endeavor that serves U.S. imperial interests, not European security.
This public refusal represents a staggering rebuke of American leadership. It is the visible fracture of the transatlantic alliance.
And it forces the U.S. into a position of strategic whiplash. Because Europe won't help, and the interceptor sink is draining resources, the U.S. is having to pull assets from other vital regions.
The military deployment logs in the sources show that the U.S. is actively pulling critical air defense systems, including SAAD batteries, out of South Korea and Japan to redeploy them to the Middle East.
They are stripping the defenses of their closest Asian allies, the exact allies they need to project power and contain China, to fight a war of choice in the Gulf.
They are abandoning the much-discussed pivot to Asia because they are physically tethered to the Middle East. It is a strategic victory for Beijing that they could not have orchestrated better themselves.
When you look at all of this, the military stall, the cascading economic shocks, the profound isolation from historic allies, it creates an immense, crushing external pressure on the U.S. administration.
Immense pressure.
Which leads us into our final area of analysis. How is this external pressure fracturing the U.S. government internally? And how desperate is the search for an off-ramp?
The internal dynamics detailed in the latest reports suggest a profound level of dysfunction and institutional buckling within the U.S. apparatus. The narrative that this war was a unified, necessary national security imperative is breaking down publicly.
The most glaring example is the resignation that just rocked Washington. The reports cite the resignation of a senior U.S. intelligence and counterterrorism official.
Resignations happen during conflicts, but the manner of this departure is highly unusual.
Yeah, he didn't go quietly.
No, the documents cite his public, vocal protest. He explicitly stated that Iran posed, quote, no imminent threat to the United States.
He publicly contradicted the entire justification, the casus belli for the war.
Yes. Furthermore, the reports note he claimed the push for this conflict was entirely driven by intense foreign lobbying and Israeli pressure, rather than genuine U.S. security interests.
For a senior intelligence official to make these claims publicly while U.S. forces are actively under fire shatters the administration's domestic narrative.
It fuels intense domestic polarization.
And that skepticism is backed up by historical contradictions highlighted in congressional testimony. Our sources point out a glaring discrepancy regarding the threat level.
According to the transcripts from recent congressional hearings, critics are pointing out that during the brief 12-day conflict last year, the U.S. administration definitively claimed that Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities had been obliterated.
Right. The message was the threat is neutralized. So the obvious question being asked now is, if the nuclear program was completely destroyed a year ago, how could it possibly have reconstituted fast enough to represent an imminent nuclear threat requiring a massive preemptive war this year?
Especially when the intelligence community itself had assessed in the interim that there was no significant effort by Tehran to rebuild that specific enrichment infrastructure.
The contradiction is causing massive cognitive dissonance on a national scale.
It is eroding public trust exactly when the administration needs it to sustain a difficult war.
And what makes this erosion of trust even worse are the allegations about what the intelligence agencies are actually doing domestically while the war is raging abroad.
This is where the political fractures become acute. According to claims made in those same congressional hearings, top U.S. intelligence officials have been accused of severely misallocating resources.
What kind of reason?
The allegations claim that critical intelligence assets were diverted away from monitoring foreign threats in the Middle East and were instead utilized to conduct domestic raids on election infrastructure.
The sources specifically mention claims of a raid in Fulton County, Georgia, based on old election conspiracy theories.
Yes. The claim presented in the hearings is that the intelligence apparatus has become deeply politicized. From a systemic perspective, regardless of the veracity of the election claims, the optics are terrible.
Very terrible.
Diverting federal intelligence resources to seize voting machines in Georgia, while U.S. bases in the Gulf are actively being bombarded by drones, paints a picture of an administration that has completely lost its strategic focus.
It portrays a government fighting itself at home while losing a war abroad. And because they lack a coherent strategy, reliable intelligence, or unified domestic support, finding an off-ramp is proving nearly impossible.
They are caught in a classic sunk cost fallacy. We have seen this historically with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan or the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Wars that are initiated with the supreme confidence of a quick, painless victory often trap the aggressor.
Because if you admit you made a mistake and pull out, it is political suicide for the administration. But if you stay and continue to bleed resources, it is strategic suicide for the nation.
Exactly. And Iran understands this dynamic perfectly. Tehran knows they currently hold the geopolitical leverage. They are not desperate for a pause. The intelligence indicates they are outright refusing offers for a simple ceasefire.
They know a simple ceasefire just allows the U.S. and Israel time to manufacture more interceptors and restock their magazines.
They will not grant that breathing room without extracting a massive price. The report suggests Tehran is demanding major structural concessions, potentially including the complete withdrawal of American military forces from the region, in exchange for lifting the financial filter on the Strait of Hormuz.
A demand that any U.S. president would find incredibly difficult to accept without appearing utterly defeated on the world stage. So the diplomatic doors are closed, the aerial war is a mathematical trap, and the economic pain is mounting.
When superpowers get backed into a corner like this, the options they consider start getting increasingly desperate.
The sources outline whispers of a potential U.S. ground invasion.
There is serious discussion among military planners, according to the leaks in our stack, about launching a ground offensive specifically targeting Karg Island.
Why Karg Island?
Because Karg Island is the terminal that handles the vast majority of Iran's crude oil exports. The logic is that if you can physically occupy their primary economic engine, you regain the leverage necessary to force them to the negotiating table.
But military analysts are vehemently warning against this. Why?
Because the mechanics of executing an amphibious assault against a heavily fortified island in the Persian Gulf, surrounded by anti-ship missile batteries and drone swarms, would result in staggering casualties. The analysts use the term meat grinder. Furthermore, attempting to push further inland into Iran itself is a logistical nightmare. The geography of Iran is characterized by immense mountain ranges and hostile deserts. It is much larger and vastly more complex to navigate than environments like Vietnam or Iraq. An invading force would be bogged down instantly.
You don't just roll a column of tanks down a highway to Tehran. The geography itself fights you.
It does. And while the U.S. contemplates these desperate offensive measures, the defensive situation for Israel is reaching a critical threshold.
This is the darkest scenario outlined in the intelligence briefs. Let's talk about the intersection of interceptor depletion and nuclear doctrine.
Israel operates a highly sophisticated, multi-tiered air defense network systems like the Iron Dome for short-range rockets, David's Sling for medium-range threats, and the Arrow 3 system for exoatmospheric ballistic missiles.
But just like the U.S. Patriot systems, those magazines are finite.
And they're being depleted rapidly. The terrifying warnings emerging from U.S. defense analysts center on what happens when those interceptor magazines finally run dry. If the defensive shield fails, Israeli population centers and critical infrastructure will face unmitigated destruction from conventional Iranian ballistic missiles.
And for a nation the size of Israel, a sustained conventional bombardment of its cities is not just a military setback. It is an existential threat to the survival of the state.
Which triggers deeply classified defensive protocols. The analysts warn that if Israel faces imminent conventional defeat and the systemic collapse of its infrastructure, their military doctrine may compel them to resort to tactical nuclear weapons to eliminate the Iranian launch sites and ensure national survival.
If there's no military solution and the economic pain is too high, are we just waiting to see who blinks first? Or is there a scenario where desperation pushes someone to push the ultimate red button nuclear escalation? They would use the ultimate weapon not out of aggression, but out of sheer desperation because their conventional shield evaporated.
While no rational actor wants to cross the nuclear threshold, the fact that this scenario is being discussed openly in the intelligence assessments we are reviewing demonstrates how dangerously out of control the escalation spiral has become. Because the U.S. lacks the domestic unity to force a compromise and the military lacks a conventional path to victory, the conflict is drifting toward catastrophic extremes.
It is a sobering, heavy reality to process. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's take a moment to step back and look at the whole board. We have tracked a staggering 20-day journey.
The velocity of this geopolitical shift is unprecedented.
We started with a promise of a 100-hour surgical shock and awe campaign. We saw how the doctrine of decapitation completely failed against an adversary that spent 30 years building a decentralized, horizontally integrated network designed specifically to survive losing its head.
We examine the brutal mathematics of the interceptor sink, how firing $10 million missiles at $20,000 drones effectively bankrupts your defensive capacity.
Which forced the conflict out of the skies and into the global economy. We saw Iran institute the smart blockade, permitting ships like the Pakistani tanker to pass, but only if they paid the toll in Chinese yuan, effectively breaking the 50-year monopoly of the U.S. petrodollar.
And we tracked how that financial filter in the Gulf triggered physical cascades across the globe, the butterfly effect. From the paralysis of 35% of the global urea supply threatening the Northern Hemisphere's planting season, to the collapse of the MRI medical supply chain due to the Qatari helium shortage, to Taiwan's semiconductor industry hanging by a 10-day energy thread that China can now exploit.
All while the United States finds itself geopolitically isolated, our oldest European allies in NATO explicitly stated not our war, while Russia's economy booms from lifted oil sanctions and China watches its currency internationalize. And internally, the U.S. administration is fracturing, with senior officials resigning in protest and intelligence agencies allegedly distracted by domestic political raids, leaving no clear off-ramp besides a suicidal ground invasion or terrifying nuclear escalation.
If we synthesize all of these sources into one overarching takeaway, it is that this conflict serves as a brutal masterclass in the realities of 21st century asymmetric warfare. It proves definitively that the power to disrupt complex, fragile global supply chains and financial networks is vastly more potent than sheer military hardware. The most advanced fighter jets and multi-million-dollar interceptors are entirely powerless to shoot down a systemic financial shock.
It is a completely new paradigm. The rules of engagement have fundamentally changed. And it brings us back to where we started, the idea that we are looking at an X-ray of the global order. The bones of the old system aren't just bruised, they are visibly shattered. So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought to mull over as you watch the headlines unfold in the coming weeks. We are witnessing the mechanisms of U.S. economic and military hegemony bleeding out in the waters of the Persian Gulf. If that era is truly ending, who is going to write the rules of the New World Order tomorrow? And more importantly, when the dust finally settles and the supply chains eventually rebuild, will the global economy ever trust a single superpower's currency to run the world again? Or have we just watched the violent birth of a permanently fractured financial world? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the underlying mechanics of this global shift. It is a massive amount of complex information to process, but understanding the why and the how behind the chaos is the only way to truly stay informed. Stay insanely curious, keep questioning the simple narratives, and we will catch you next time.